Hello and welcome to Lesson 6 Video 2. We finished off doing the pathway of blood through the heart. I hope you watched it a few times and really outlined it on your note guide and labeled all of your structures and then off to the side put them in the correct order, because that's a really important concept to understand and you'll be tested on it quite a lot. So we're going to continue on with the heart, and first we need to talk about something called cardiac circulation. This is blood that actually is nourishing the myocardium. So the blood that's flowing through the atria and ventricles and the valves, that's just flowing through to get pumped to body tissues. That's not actually the blood that's supplying the nutrients to the heart. Cardiac circulation is the blood that is nourishing the heart. And you have what are called coronary arteries. These are really big arteries that branch from the base of the aorta and encircle the entire heart. These are the arteries that, when they get clogged, cause heart attacks because you're not providing nutrients to the heart. So these are really the arteries that get clogged with plaque and then eventually cause death of that muscle tissue because your myocardium isn't receiving any nutrients. So myocardium blood is going to be drained by cardiac veins. So through those coronary arteries and those circumflex arteries, you're going to basically exchange oxygen and nutrients with carbon dioxide and waste. And then the carbon dioxide and waste is going to be drained by cardiac veins and then into a pretty enlarged vessel called the coronary sinus. So these are what I'm talking about. So branching off of the aorta, you have these huge coronary arteries. Here's one, and here's two, and then you have your circumflex artery here, which actually travels around the back. So it's these arteries on the outside of the heart that get clogged with plaque, okay, if you're unhealthy or you have heart disease, and these are what cause a heart attack to occur. Next, we're going to talk about your heart's electrical system or conduction system, and I think this is actually a pretty interesting subject. Your heart has a basic rhythm, okay? If you feel your heartbeat right now, it's dun-dun, 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 dun-dun. And this is because you have very special tissue that allows this to happen. It's a mix of neural and cardiac muscle. So for example, your heart is going to beat about 75 times a minute, and it starts in the atria and travels down through the ventricles. So your major pacemaker, the actual tissue that is setting the rhythm of your heartbeat, is called the SA node, or the sinoatrial node, and it's located up in the very corner of the right atrium, and this is the kind of electrical impulse that's going to start each heartbeat. And once this actually depolarizes and you have an impulse, it's going to travel down to what we call the AV node. So your AV node is basically what's going to cause the rest of the impulse to travel through the heart. So it's going to start in the SA node, and then the impulse is going to travel to the AV node. Once it goes into the AV node, it's going to travel down what's called the bundle of His, which is basically just a large portion of this cardiac nervous system, weird hybrid tissue. Once it goes down the bundle of His, this is actually going to go right through the interventricular septum. It's going to separate into what we call bundle branches, and then those bundle branches are going to split off into Purkinje fibers. And these Purkinje fibers are little microscopic fibers of this neural cardiac tissue that's going to innervate the entire ventricles and cause the contraction of the ventricles. So if we look here, where's my mouse? There we go. Here is your SA node. This is known as your heart's pacemaker. It's going to start every single contraction of the heart. Next, the impulse is going to travel down to what we call the AV node, and this is going to cause the rest of the heart to contract. So your SA node is going to cause your atria to contract, then your impulse is going to travel down the bundle of His, which is right here. It's going to split into what we call these bundle branches, so that's your fourth structure. And then it's going to travel into all of these little tiny fibers here called Purkinje fibers. And these Purkinje fibers are going to innervate all the myocardium of the ventricles and help the muscle down here of the ventricles to contract. So these Purkinje fibers are going to cause really the contraction of the ventricles, but that whole impulse is going to start in the SA node, which causes the atria to contract, and then the AV node is going to allow the rest of the contraction to occur, to actually travel down into the ventricles and contract the ventricles. And that's how your heart can actually create that kind of electrical impulse and actually cause the muscles to contract. All right, cardiac, heart, and sounds. We've all had somebody listen to your heart when you're going to the doctor, so we're going to talk about the cardiac cycle and those different sounds that the doctors are listening for. So you have what's called systole and dystole, or diastole. I've heard it pronounced both ways. So systole is when the heart is contracting, and dystole is when the heart is relaxing. So really, during systole is when your ventricles are contracting, dystole is when the ventricles are relaxing and the atria are contracting. And the cardiac cycle is all of the events that we're going to talk about that has to occur to complete one heartbeat. So your cardiac cycle is going to be divided into three major events. You have mid to late dystole, ventricular systole, and early dystole. And this is exactly what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about these three stages here of the cardiac cycle. So the first is mid to late dystole. So this is when your blood pressure is really low, your semilunar valves are completely closed, but your AV valves are open. So this is when blood is now in the atria, and the atria are contracting and forcing blood into your ventricles. So this is these two pictures here. So blood has now filled the atria. They're going to travel through those AV valves and start filling the ventricles. Next is ventricular systole. So this is when the ventricles now have increased pressure because they're filled with blood. The AV valves are going to close so we don't have any backflow. And once the pressure in the ventricles is high enough, we're going to have a contraction. The semilunar valves are going to be forced open and blood is going to rush out of the ventricles. And as this is happening, blood is already actually starting to fill the atria. Okay, so here is our ventricular systole. We have building pressure down here in the ventricles. It's going to force those semilunar valves open. Blood is going to rush through the ventricles or out the ventricles. And at the same time, our atria are going to start filling with blood. And then our last is early dystole. The ventricles have now relaxed. The semilunar valves close, so we don't have any backflow. And the AV valves are going to be eventually forced open again once the atria can have enough pressure with them, and that is the entire cycle. Okay, so here is early dystole here. Our blood has been forced out of the ventricles up into the aorta and the pulmonary arteries. The atria are almost filled and the AV valves are going to be opening very soon. All right, heart sounds. This is when a doctor listens to your heart. They're listening for two sounds, the lub-dup sound, lub-dup, lub-dup, lub-dup. The lub sound that they're listening for is actually the closing of the AV valves, and your second sound, the dup sound, is the semilunar valves. And if a doctor hears an irregular heart sound, maybe something's off on that lub or dup, it's referred to as a murmur. You've probably heard that term before, a heart murmur. That's what that means. There's usually some sort of valve issue going on. Usually they're not serious though. All right, physiology of the heart. We're going to be talking about stroke volume and cardiac output. So stroke volume is the volume of blood pumped by each ventricle per heartbeat. And your cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped out by each side of the heart in 1 minute. To find your cardiac output, you take stroke volume and times your heart rate. Stroke volume and cardiac output are really important when we look at how healthy the heart is. You actually want a really high stroke volume. The higher your stroke volume, the more blood you're pushing out of a ventricle, the better, because that means that your myocardium is really strong and you're having a really hard muscular contraction. So you want a high stroke volume and you want a high cardiac output. That means that the heart is being able to pump out a lot of blood. So example, to find your cardiac output, let's say someone has a stroke volume of 70 milliliters of blood per heartbeat at 75 beats a minute. That means that they're going to be pumping out 5,250 milliliters of blood per minute. And it's obviously going to vary by person. So stroke volume is really important when looking at how healthy the heart is, how much your cardiac muscle can actually stretch and contract. The harder your myocardium can contract, the more blood it's going to be able to push out. And a healthy heart can pump out about 60% of the blood present in the ventricles. And if you go back to that cardiac output or that cardiac cycle picture, you can see that there is some blood left over in the ventricles. That's really normal as long as it's not flowing back into the atria. So the more blood you're pumping out, the healthier the heart. And now we're going to look at some of the factors that can modify your heart rate. First of all, the sympathetic nervous system is going to be able to stimulate your SA and AV nodes during times of stress. Okay, if we're stressed out, we release epinephrine, and that's going to increase our SA node conduction, and we're going to have an increased heart rate. We also can have an excessive calcium or potassium can have an effect on your heart rate. It can actually increase your heart rate. Age, the older you get, the harder it is for your heart to beat. So if you look a lot of times at the gym, your maximum heart rate as you get older goes down. Body temperature, the hotter you are, the faster your heart's going to beat. Exercise is going to increase your heart rate. And then gender. Females, we're going to have tend to have a little bit of a faster resting heart rate than males. And this really kind of outlines everything that's going to increase or decrease cardiac output, so how much blood you're pumping through. Stroke volume is a big one. You want to have a high stroke volume. You want to have a steady heart rate. You don't want a heart rate too high, because if your heart rate is too high, then your chambers aren't going to be able to fill all the way up and your stroke volume is going to go down. So if you have a super increased heart rate, a lot of times we see stroke volume go down because we're not able to fill the chambers properly. Okay, your sympathetic nervous system is going to increase it. Okay, sympathetic nervous system, we're going to have a higher cardiac output. Parasympathetic is going to decrease that cardiac output. Epinephrine released from that sympathetic nervous system, really going to increase the heart rate. If you have low blood pressure, we're going to try to increase cardiac output so that we're pumping more blood through. So this really kind of just outlines everything that's going to happen. Alright, so thanks for watching video 2. We are done with our first lesson on the cardiovascular system. Lesson 7, we get into the different types of vessels, and then we get into what really controls blood pressure. Alright, thanks for watching, guys.